Elliot stared in disbelief at the bright yellow boot clamped to his pickup tire. It was a quiet Sunday morning, and no one had knocked. The sun had barely crested over the treetops, and Red Hollow Ridge sat quiet and clean under a soft October sky. The maple trees dropped crisp red leaves that twirled gently onto the damp sidewalk. Elliot, still in his flannel robe and house slippers, held a steaming mug of coffee as he stood frozen beside his truck. The boot glinted like a warning light in the early morning calm. "Lord," he muttered, crouching for a better look. He traced his hand along the cold metal and checked all the windows. No note, no knock, no warning. His wife's old words came back to him like a gust of cold air. Some folks get drunk on power, even without a sip of liquor. He huffed and stepped back, surveying the street. No one else seemed to be up yet, except for the squirrels and a crow picking at a bagel someone had dropped near the sidewalk. He walked back inside, put on jeans, and came out dialing the HOA hotline from the fridge magnet on his door. The line rang 5 times before landing him in voicemail. "You've reached Red Hollow Ridge Community Association. Please leave a message. For bylaw violations, press 3. For appeals, email." He hung up. An hour later, he found himself sipping weak coffee at Marla's Diner, where the windows fogged up every morning and the plates came heavy with butter and comfort. Marla herself was at the griddle, flipping pancakes with her usual hum. He greeted her with a wave and slipped a 5 into the tip jar before finding Red Ellis at the corner booth, hunched over eggs and toast. "She did it again," Red said before Elliot even sat. Elliot arched a brow. "Marge?" Red nodded, tapping the edge of his ceramic plate. "Overnight parking ban, changed last week, no warning, no vote, slipped it into the revised bylaws and had Al print them Friday. I didn't get a copy of them. You wouldn't. She only sent them to folks on the board." Elliot rubbed his forehead. "I wasn't even on the curb. My own driveway." "She doesn't care." Red leaned closer. "You remember last month when she fined Mrs. Tooley for painting her porch swing? I thought that was her son's doing." "Nope, Marge again." The waitress refilled Elliot's cup and he thanked her with a small smile. As he stirred in cream, his eyes drifted towards the obituaries page tucked between the sugar jar and the napkin holder, 2 names he recognized. He tapped the page once in silent thought. He paid in cash and waved to Marla, who called after him, "Say hi to the boys on their bikes, would you?" Outside, 2 kids zipped by on BMXs and Elliot raised his hand. "Watch the leaves," he called out, smiling as they wobbled slightly to adjust. By midday, he stood in front of the HOA office, locked of course. He taped a short complaint letter to the door and walked home just as a white envelope arrived in his mailbox. Inside, a typed invoice read, "Unauthorized overnight vehicle presence. Fine $185, 0 cents. Due within 10 business days." Below that, a note in sharp handwriting. "See updated bylaw Article 4, Section 3. Red showed up that afternoon with a rolled-up zoning map under his arm. "You're not going to like this," he said, spreading it across Elliot's kitchen table. Elliot traced the lines with a finger. "The clubhouse sits here, right?" Red nodded. "Yep. And this lot right behind it? Vacant. Been that way since before either of us moved here." Elliot narrowed his eyes, circling the space with a pencil. "Who owns this?" he asked. The lot was overgrown and forgotten, except it shared a back border with the HOA clubhouse's only rear access gate. Elliot stood just outside the rusted chain-link fence, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes narrowed as he took in the unruly weeds and saplings that had crept in over the years. The grass came up past his shins, golden and brittle, rustling in the cool October breeze. His breath fogged faintly and a distant lawnmower hummed somewhere in the neighborhood. A red squirrel darted through the brush and disappeared behind an old post. That rear gate, a battered aluminum thing, sat crooked on its hinges, barely visible now from the public trail behind the lot. "If you're going to enforce the rules," Elliot had once joked to Red, "best make sure you read them first." Back at Red's garage that afternoon, he spread out the photocopied zoning map across a workbench scarred with old oil stains. Red, with his glasses perched on the tip of his nose, tapped a finger at the highlighted parcel. "There," he said. "Lot 42 EB. Never developed. County took it back 3 years ago. No structures, no liens. Elliot leaned closer. And it's not part of the HOA's holdings? Nope. Technically, they just used it for years, probably didn't even think twice about it. That back gate? Pure convenience. They drove to the town zoning office the next morning, the courthouse's limestone steps, still damp from a misty night. Mrs. Colby at the zoning desk wore a navy cardigan and glasses that hung from a beaded chain. She peered at the request through her readers and then smiled, tilting her head. Huh? She said. You're right. Lot 42B hasn't been touched. Foreclosed. City holding the deed. Cash sale only. Elliot nodded slowly. How soon can it be transferred? 2 business days if you pay today. She lowered her voice slightly. Funny thing, the HOA has submitted permit requests near that area a few times but never claimed ownership. He returned home with a manila envelope containing the property details and a receipt. He stood on his porch for a while that evening, watching the leaves skitter across the sidewalk. The kids on bikes didn't ride by that night. Too cold, maybe. He walked inside, opened the bottom drawer of his desk, and took out an envelope stuffed with bills, meticulously stacked and labeled by year. Savings from his consulting work. At Marla's diner the next day, Susan Linney joined the counter crowd, quietly venting to Marla about a fine for her fence posts not being uniform in color. Elliot offered a polite nod as he stirred his coffee. Mark sent out 3 citations last week, Susan murmured. She's on a spree again. Marla just refilled Elliot's mug. She needs a hobby that doesn't involve clipboards. That evening, deed in hand, Elliot walked the perimeter of the newly purchased lot. At the corner where the clubhouse fence met the woods, he paused at the sagging gate. A worn footpath ran straight through the lot, trampled grass and a faint trail of candy wrappers and shoe prints. It had clearly become a habit, a shortcut no one questioned. He knelt and pounded a wooden stake into the soft earth, then another. Red helped him stretch twine between them, careful to avoid damage. What are you doing? Red asked as Elliot straightened a laminated sign. Elliot stood back and surveyed their handiwork. The plastic sign read, Mere property, no trespassing. Just establishing boundaries, Elliot said. Later that week, an official-looking envelope arrived at his door. Inside, a typed letter from the HOA board stated that any acts of obstruction or signage contradicting neighborhood easements were subject to review and could result in mediation.
Elliot folded the letter neatly and tucked it into the same drawer as the deed. That night, he walked alone past the town's small veterans memorial. He stopped to read the names on the stone, brushing off a leaf that had settled there. A memory drifted in. His wife on their old back porch, sipping cider and saying with a sly smile, "Keep good fences, Elle. Makes good neighbors." Back at Red's garage, Elliot examined a stack of plywood and rope. Red raised an eyebrow.
Building something? Elliot smiled faintly. Not blocking anything? Yet! By dawn, a 4-foot wooden fence stood where the clubhouse back gate once freely opened onto the lot. The boards were freshly sanded, pale in the early light, and lined up so straight that they looked measured by spirit level. Dew clung to their surface, catching the first rays of morning like glass beads. Red and Elliot had finished late the night before, working by the glow of hanging work lights powered from Red's old generator. Elliot had insisted the fence adhere to every inch of regulation, 4 feet tall, 3 inches between slats, and a 15-inch clearance at the property's rear corner to comply with access codes.
Now the gate behind the clubhouse swung open awkwardly, only to meet a polite wooden barrier. Not blocked, just rerouted.
Elliot sipped coffee from his thermos, standing with hands in jacket pockets, taking in the sight. A pair of boys pedaled by on their way to school, craning their necks to get a better look. Cool fence, mister. H, one called. Is that for a fort? Elliot just smiled. Something like that. Later that morning, Marge stood by the newly erected fence, arms crossed and lips drawn so tight they looked pressed shut with clothespins. She wore a maroon tracksuit, clipboard in hand, and muttered into her phone before turning to Elliot, who had just arrived with Red.
This, she began, pointing at the wood, violates the aesthetic agreement outlined in section.
Elliot held out a folded letter. Signed, zoning approval. Lot is not HOA jurisdiction. She blinked, took the paper, scanned the letter, then folded it again with visible annoyance. You're making a spectacle. Red couldn't help himself. Funny how much light a little fence can shine, huh? Marge turned without answering, and her sneakers made a huffy squeak as she stormed away. By week's end, the bulletin board outside the HOA office carried 3 notices, one about a proposed emergency meeting, one clarifying regulations on fencing, and one hand-printed flyer advertising a neighborhood pie bake-off. Someone was trying to lighten the mood.
At Marla's diner, Elliot claimed his usual booth by the window. Marla brought over the harvest special without asking, scrambled eggs, sweet potato hash, and a cranberry muffin. He slid a $10 tip under his plate and took a moment to watch the cars go by outside.
Susan Linney walked in and after ordering a tea slipped into the seat across from him. I heard you got a letter about your fence, she said. I did, he replied calmly, along with a few compliments. She chuckled. I got a citation for my mailbox last week. Said the shade of blue wasn't approved. She made air quotes with one hand. I've had that same mailbox for 6 years. Sounds familiar, Elliot said, sipping his coffee. They're reaching. I don't suppose you want to talk about this sometime, over coffee, maybe not at a diner? He hesitated, then nodded slowly. I'd like that. The following day, Elliot added solar lights to the base of the fence, small low-glow ones that cast a gentle outline come nightfall. He also planted a row of chrysanthemums in planters that faced the clubhouse side. Nothing aggressive, nothing bold, just thoughtful landscaping. Red watched from the driveway with arms crossed, grinning.
You're getting good at this, he said.
Elliot shrugged, just tending to my property. As neighbors strolled by, some waved, others avoided eye contact. Word had spread. Kids from down the street had taken to calling it the fence war, half joking, half wide-eyed. Elliot pretended not to hear, but couldn't suppress a small smile when he caught them pointing. Friday, the HOA attempted to hold an emergency meeting in the clubhouse, new chairs, fresh printed agendas, but when the time came, only 7 residents arrived, not enough for a quorum. Marge stood at the front, fuming behind the folding table while the few attendees shuffled their feet, unsure what to do. Elliot, standing just outside the open door, nodded once and walked away. At twilight, as Elliot returned home, a dark sedan pulled into his driveway. The man who stepped out was tall, maybe early 40s, with the resemblance Elliot recognized immediately. Kyle Kavanaugh, Marge's son. They hadn't spoken in years.
Kyle approached slowly, hands in his jacket pockets. She's not going to stop, you know.
2 signs appeared overnight, one reading, Pilot Property, the other, Community Entrance Closed until further notice. Elliot stood at the edge of his lot just after sunrise, his breath forming soft puffs in the chill November air. Red stood beside him, hands in his vest pockets, eyeing the bold lettering with a neutral expression. Didn't think you were the signage type, Red said. I'm not, Elliot replied, but someone keeps mistaking clear lines for suggestion.
The wind rustled through the now barren trees, and the distant hum of a leaf blower echoed through Red Hollow Ridge. The clubhouse gate was padlocked from the inside, and a narrow plastic chain hung across its width. It looked less like security and more like a tantrum rendered in hardware.
Kyle's voice from days before lingered in Elliot's mind. She's not going to stop. Marge's first move had come via a wave of fresh warning letters. Susan received one for seasonal displays exceeding HOA guidelines. Her modest string of white lights hadn't even reached the porch railing. Mr. Jameson, who had flown a small American flag from his stoop since 1982, was fined $50.00 for unauthorized freestanding display. He folded the citation and in a rare display of frustration mumbled that maybe he should fly the whole pole. At Marla's diner, the usual morning chatter had been overtaken by HOA drama. Marla, always quick with a dry joke, taped a paper sign near the coffee pots. No HOA talk. $1.00 fine per complaint. Susan laughed at it as she slid into the booth across from Elliot. They've started citing people for mailbox wit now, she said. Patty's box is 2 inches too wide, according to Marge's ruler. Elliot stirred cream into his coffee, then slid a folder across the table. Take a look at this. Inside were printouts of HOA bylaws, 2 sets, one stamped from the county archives dated last year, the other a freshly typed version marked updated spring 2023. Certain sections were newly bolded or italicized. Section 4.3, which now dictated exact mailbox measurements, hadn't existed in the official version. She never filed the revision, he said. Kyle checked the digital record. Nothing submitted, no meeting minutes, no vote. Susan's brows lifted. That's not just sneaky. That's illegal. Marge thinks no one reads the fine print. Red joined them moments later, sliding into the booth with a faint grunt. He eyed the folder and whistled low. Well, we've got her forgeries. Back at Red's garage, Kyle arrived quietly. He looked tired, his posture weighed down by something heavier than the morning. I found backups of the HOA site, he said, handing Elliot a flash drive. She posted the changes in April, but never submitted anything official. He didn't even tell you, Susan asked. Kyle shook his head. I don't know who she's listening to anymore. Things came to a head later that week when Marge ordered landscapers to freshen up the community shrubs. In the process, 2 hedge trimmers mistakenly crossed into Elliot's lot, cutting away part of the border where he'd planted the chrysanthemums. One worker waved apologetically, clearly unaware of the property line. Elliot said nothing at the moment. That evening, he walked into the zoning office, quietly filed a notice of encroachment, and left a copy with the clerk, who raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. Saturday morning, the diner was abuzz. Marla served hash browns with one eye on the HOA memo board posted near the door. It now held 3 new notices, each printed in red ink. No one read them. Elliot sat with Susan and Red, sliding the printed bylaws between them. He had highlighted every illegal amendment. They never filed the revision legally, he said simply. Red nodded slowly. Then it doesn't hold. There was a long pause. Susan looked up, her expression thoughtful but clear. What if we start a petition to recall the board? The fall potluck was meant to bring neighbors together, but the tension was thicker than the chili. Long tables stretched across the community green, flanked by folding chairs and covered in mismatched tablecloths. Slow cookers buzzed softly alongside trays of baked beans, deviled eggs, and a cherry cobbler already missing a corner. A dozen pies sat untouched on one end, and the banana pudding, Marla's special, remained suspiciously full. For a town that once lined up twice for her desserts, that alone said something. Elliot arrived just after 5, a Tupperware of cornbread in hand and Red walking beside him with a cooler full of hot dogs. The sun hung low, casting long golden stripes across the grass, while kids tossed a football just beyond the tables. Conversations sparked in little bursts, first cautious, then gradually louder. What once were whispered complaints at the diner had grown into full voices. Thank you for putting up that fence, Elliot, said Mr. Ramirez, clasping his hand. It showed we're not powerless. Others chimed in, some offering quiet nods, others bold pats on the back. Elliot acknowledged them with modest nods, but said little. He hadn't done any of this to lead a movement. Marge arrived 20 minutes in, her red jacket buttoned tight, lips pursed, clipboard in hand. Kyle trailed a few steps behind, his gaze flickering toward the food table but never landing. Marge cleared her throat near the center. If I could have everyone's attention, she began, her voice tight with forced cheer. Susan, standing near a tray of lasagna, stepped forward smoothly. Actually, Marge, before you begin, would you mind confirming whether the board ever filed the spring bylaw amendments with the county? There was a murmur, a few eyebrows raised. Marge blinked, thrown off. We posted them publicly. That's adequate per clause. Susan held up a packet neatly stapled with several lines highlighted in pink. Clause 2.13 actually states amendments must be voted on and submitted to county records within 30 days of adoption. That didn't happen. Red chimed in from the grill, flipping a hot dog with theatrical flair. We brought copies, annotated and everything. Kyle looked down at his shoes. Several neighbors leaned in as Elliot and Susan passed out the packets. A few flipped through the pages, mouths set firm as they absorbed the information. Even Mrs. Jameson, who usually stayed quiet, was nodding along as she read. Marge tried to regain control. This potluck is supposed to be about unity, not politics. Susan didn't raise her voice. Unity starts with fairness. There was silence for a beat, then the unmistakable sound of a pen clicking.
Susan held up a clipboard. We're starting a recall petition. If you believe our board should reflect the will of the residents, please sign. At first, no one moved. Then Red stepped forward, wiped his hands on a napkin, and signed. Thought I'd be the first one kicked out of this place. Guess I'll be the first to sign, too. Mrs. Jameson followed, nodding gently. It's time. One by one, neighbors came forward. Some were cautious, others eager. Kyle stood frozen, jaw clenched, watching the line form. Marge didn't speak again. She stepped back, almost disappearing into the fold of the evening. Elliot didn't stay long. He handed his cornbread to Marla and muttered a quiet goodbye. As he walked home, the dusk painted everything orange and still. Fallen leaves crunched underfoot, and for a moment, the sounds of the gathering faded behind him. There was a certified envelope waiting in his mailbox. He opened it on the porch, heart steady even as his eyes scanned the header. Notice of legal action, it read. The Red Hollow Ridge HOA intends to pursue litigation for obstruction of community access. Elliot stood in front of a packed room in the clubhouse, wondering how a quiet man like him had ended up here. Rain tapped steadily against the tall windows, a soft percussion behind the muted buzz of folding chairs and low murmurs. The HOA clubhouse, usually hollow and half-lit, now brimmed with neighbors. Some clutched steaming styrofoam cups of burnt coffee. Others clutched copies of the bylaws like shields. Elliot shifted his weight, the hum of tension pressing against his spine. He hadn't asked to be the face of anything, but here he was. On the wall behind him, a bulletin board displayed flyers for seasonal gutter cleaning and an outdated pancake breakfast. Below it, Susan adjusted her reading glasses and stepped up to the front table. We have the required number of signatures, she announced, voice calm but certain. In fact, we exceeded it. Marge sat stiffly to one side, lips pursed, arms folded tightly across her chest. Kyle stood near the back of the room, expression unreadable, rainwater still dotting his jacket. Mr. Dent, the HOA's legal counsel, flipped through a binder as thick as a phone book. Elliot raised a hand slightly. Before anything begins, he said, I'd like to speak briefly. Heads turned. A few nodded. One elderly woman whispered to her friend, That's him? Elliot's voice was low but even. This isn't about embarrassment or revenge. It's about fairness. When we all live here, we should all understand the rules and how they change. He looked around, landing on familiar faces. I believe in kindness, but kindness doesn't mean silence. A ripple of soft agreement moved through the chairs. Marge's fingers twitched. Mr. Dent cleared his throat. As counsel for the HOA, I've reviewed the procedural history. The spring amendments to the bylaws were not voted on in accordance with the Articles of Incorporation. Therefore, any fines or penalties issued under those changes are legally void. The sent a visible jolt through the room. Marge leaned forward. With all due respect, Mr. Dent, this feels like a witch hunt. Susan straightened. It's due process. Elliot stayed seated this time, letting others carry the momentum. He watched as Red patted Mrs. Jameson's shoulder, as Susan distributed clean copies of the official recall notice, as the resident slowly found the courage to speak. Kyle remained motionless at the back, staring at the wet floor tiles. After a pause, Mr. Dent continued. Given the number of verified petitioners, the HOA is now required to hold a formal recall vote. That meeting is scheduled for next Wednesday at 7:00 p.m. All residents in good standing will be allowed to vote. Marge opened her mouth but didn't speak. Instead, she gathered her papers one by one and stacked them with too much precision. Her eyes didn't rise. As the meeting wound down, voices softened. Neighbors who had argued over mailbox colors and bird feeders now exchanged shy smiles and awkward nods. A feeling, not quite resolution, but the promise of it, hung in the air like the scent of ozone. Susan packed up her clipboard last. She turned to the group, still lingering in the back. "Let's vote," she said clearly, "and let's do it right this time." Elliot didn't stay for the small talk. He made his way home, the umbrella bobbing slightly above him in the gray drizzle. At the porch steps, he paused. Kyle stood there, shoulders tense, hands in his pockets. "You didn't have to say anything back there," Kyle said, eyes still on the steps. "I thought it might help," Elliot replied. Kyle finally looked up. "I'll help, but only if we fix this the right way." The recall ballot sat in a rusted tin box beside the coffee urn. By sunset, the neighborhood would choose. The clubhouse smelt faintly of burnt filters and lemon disinfectant. A breeze swept through the cracked window panes, tugging at the corner of the HOA newsletter pinned near the sign-in table. It was Veterans Day, and golden leaves cartwheeled past the entrance like confetti nature had thrown just for the occasion. Ved stood near the back, pouring thick coffee into mismatched mugs. He nodded at each resident as they arrived, a quiet sentinel in flannel and denim. Elliot leaned near the doorway, not quite inside, but not entirely out. He had no clipboard, no speech, and certainly no sign. Susan moved with quiet purpose. She greeted folks with a smile, guided them to the tin box, and gave no instructions beyond "take your time." Her presence alone seemed enough. Marge entered just after 10. She looked older than the week before, as if each petition signature had etched a line deeper into her brow. Her beige cardigan hung unevenly, one button mismatched. She didn't look at Elliot as she passed him. Didn't look at Kyle either. But she stepped up to the front anyway. "I suppose," she began, "that no one really understands how hard this job is until they're in it." Her voice wasn't defensive, just tired. "I did what I thought kept order. Order matters." She paused, hands trembling as they smoothed her notes. "But perhaps I didn't listen well enough." No one interrupted. Susan didn't rebut, just stood nearby, still. Marge folded the paper and dropped it into her purse. Then, for the first time in a long time, she stepped down from the platform without finishing her thought. Outside, Elliot knelt by the flower beds flanking the fence. He trimmed the browning mums and adjusted a small solar light that had tilted in the wind. The clubhouse bustled behind him, but he didn't need to watch. He just needed to be seen. Present, grounded. People came and went all day. Some brought casserole dishes to the makeshift lunch table. Others lingered over coffee, murmuring in ways that had more warmth than worry now. Mrs. Jameson arrived with a cane and her daughter, who guided her gently to the box. At 3, Kyle announced the box was sealed. He carried it to a long table and opened it with a screwdriver someone had fished out of a junk drawer. No computers, no vote counters, just Kyle, 5 neighbors as witnesses, and 1 click pen per tally. The room was hushed, not tense, as if everyone had already made peace with what was coming. When the final count was called, Kyle cleared his throat. "The recall passes. A new interim board will be selected next week." There were no cheers, just a ripple of murmurs, a few deep exhales, and 1 or 2 chuckles near the coffee pot. Red nodded once, then walked over to the corner of the clubhouse where the old red Hollow Ridge HOA sign hung askew. He didn't say a word, just unhooked it, sanded one side with his sleeve, and began applying a fresh coat of paint. A neighbor handed him a brush without being asked. Susan sat beside Elliot on the clubhouse steps as dusk settled. "You know," she said, "you didn't have to plant those mums. No one asked you to." "I know," Elliot replied, brushing dirt from his hands. "But someone had to." She smiled. Later, as Elliot walked home alone, a familiar shuffle of boots sounded behind him. "You could have led the board, you know," Kyle said, falling into step beside him. Elliot smiled, the porch lights of Red Hollow Ridge beginning to flicker on. "And deny them the joy of meetings?" Elliot hammered the final nail into a fresh wooden post. A hand-painted sign read, "Welcome, neighbors. Please use front gate." The afternoon sun was kinder than expected for November. It filtered through the last yellow leaves, casting warm light over the table beside the fence, where a tray of oatmeal cookies, 2 thermoses of cider, and a tiny American flag fluttered gently. Someone had found red napkins with faded snowmen and laid them out anyway, because why not? Susan adjusted the stack of paper cups as Elliot stepped back to admire the new sign. "Handwriting's not bad," she said. "I had to keep it legible. No fine print today," Elliot replied, brushing sawdust from his flannel sleeve. The fence still stood, but now it had a gate, a simple latch, and a small bell that chimed when opened. No cameras, no posted hours, just trust and a freshly swept path leading toward the clubhouse. It looked ordinary. That was the charm. Red arrived in his beat-up Ford, honking once. He stepped out in a new navy ball cap that read, "Old Guys for Better HOAs" in crooked white embroidery. "Found it online," he said proudly, tipping the brim. "Took 2 weeks and 3 tries, but it finally shipped." He handed Elliot a packet of daffodil bulbs wrapped in newspaper. "You plant these in the cold. They surprise you come spring, kind of like you." The new board had met that morning. Susan helped lead the session, calm and transparent. Copies of properly filed bylaws were printed and pinned to the bulletin board outside the clubhouse. No one shouted. No one slammed a door. Elliot didn't attend. Instead, he'd spent his day raking leaves from the edge of the lot and sanding down the rough spots on the fence. Red brought over a stool and a second rake, and the two worked mostly in silence. The kind old friends knew how to keep. By 3 o'clock, the smell of cider had drawn more folks over. Mrs. Jameson arrived with pumpkin bread wrapped in foil. The Henderson twins brought folding chairs. A neighbor Elliot didn't recognize, maybe knew, dropped off a pie and introduced her golden retriever to everyone like it was a toddler. Kyle appeared quietly, wearing gloves and carrying a small solar-powered light fixture. He didn't make a speech. He just nodded to Elliot and began mounting it near the clubhouse rear door. The soft glow meant to light the new shared path. No one objected. Even Marge had made her final gesture without a scene. Her moving van had pulled out early that morning. A neighbor said she'd left a note on the bulletin board. "Good luck, sincerely." No one took it down. Around sunset, Elliot unfolded a worn photo album and laid it open on the table. Old block party snapshots, kids in face paint, potluck tables groaning with casseroles. Neighbors, young and old, sat under clear plastic sleeves. Susan leaned over his shoulder. "Is that you in the inflatable sumo suit?" Elliot gave a sheepish grin. "I'll deny it under oath." Laughter floated through the crisp air. The clubhouse porch had been swept, its trim freshly painted. Someone had tied little ribbons to the railings. It wasn't grand, but it looked like people had cared. Elliot knelt by the fence and planted one last row of mums, yellow and red, still in bloom. Red bent down beside him, digging gently. They didn't say anything. Nearby, someone lit sparklers for the kids, who squealed as they danced across the lawn. The moment felt easy. The lot was no longer a battleground. It was just space, a place people could walk through, sit down, pass a cookie, share a day. Susan approached with 2 plates, handing Elliot one. The pie slice wobbled slightly as he took it. "Do you ever think about running for something?" "I did. I ran out of patience," Elliot chuckles. "But maybe next spring." As the porch lights blinked on and the last sparklers faded, Red Hollow Ridge felt like itself again, weathered but whole. The quiet courage of one neighbor had nudged an entire community to look up, speak out, and remember what it meant to belong. Rules should protect, not punish, and power, left unchecked, will always need a counterweight. Like a well-built fence with a thoughtful gate, boundaries can include, not just divide. And maybe, just maybe, it's never too late to stand beside your neighbors and plant something better.